Good evening, everybody. My name is Alex McDonald. I'm the business administrator for the Township of Millburn. Just want to thank you all for coming out this evening. Tonight we're holding a public information session on affordable housing with a particular focus on the 100% affordable development that's slated for a portion of the DPW site. We are scheduled tonight from 7 p.m. to 9 p.m., although we could probably push that a little bit depending on where the Q&A portion of tonight's meeting is at. I'm pleased that tonight we have all of the professionals that are a part or will be a part of the Township's affordable housing settlement and compliance with that settlement agreement, including the development firm from RPM. Just a brief introduction to those that are with us tonight. Certainly they can add to it should they choose. But we have Beth McManus, who is the special planner on affordable housing for the Township, and from Kyle McManus. Ed Buzak of the Buzak Law Group, who serves as special counsel for affordable housing. Ed also serves as the Township's planning board attorney. Graham Petto, a senior land use planner from Topology, who is the Township's planning firm. Joe Mariziti, the Township's attorney that specializes in development and land use from Mariziti and Falcon. Joe Portelli of RPM, and Anthony Agosta of Ingles Architecture and Engineering, who is working with RPM on the development. A brief outline of tonight's agenda or meeting. We are, and I know we've been through this several times, so I want to assure people that we are not going to go through the entire history of affordable housing and the settlement agreement in its entirety. However, we are just going to briefly touch on the settlement status and some updates on that. We are also going to let everybody know how we're moving forward thus far on the 100% affordable development, and an update from RPM and or some additional information or a rehash of what was the presentation that was given on February 15th. And then, of course, the most important part is the public Q&A, which will take up a vast portion of tonight's meeting. Just by way of the notice of this meeting, while it was not officially noticed in any designated newspaper or anything like that, we did have this announced several times at the Township Committee meeting. It was on social media as well as the Township's website, and certainly was put out there in a variety of different places, and even a few days ago on tap. So just also for everyone that's here, and as we ask questions, Hometown TV is here in the back taping the meeting tonight. We will certainly, once that gets processed by them, we will put that up on the Township's website for everybody who wasn't able to make it tonight, who would like to view it again, or you know, the such, they can then go to the Township's website and view that. So just a few ground rules for tonight as we kind of go through the session. Just ask everybody to be respectful and conduct yourself well tonight in terms of debate and question. Remember, we're here to debate the matter, not the people. Please do not call out your clap during the Q&A portion. Speakers will have 3 minutes, which is traditional as we've gone through these types of meetings, to ensure that everybody gets an opportunity to ask their question. Certainly, if we have time, we'll go back around and we'll let people ask additional questions or follow-up questions. Once people ask those questions, we'll then let the panel or the professionals that are here, you know, answer those questions. Just so everybody's aware, the Township does have a section on its website dedicated to affordable housing. You can locate that by going to Our Community, and there's a section there called Affordable Housing, and there's a bunch of information on that, including past sessions that we've conducted in terms of information on affordable housing, as well as settlement document, various ordinances that have been passed for certain compliance mechanisms with the Annie Says property or the Woodmont property. Basically all the documents that we have and any presentations that we have and some information on the particular sites that are a part of this are also on there, so that if you're looking for a sort of a one-stop shop in terms of affordable housing information, this is where it would be at. Just briefly, an update on some of those compliance mechanisms for the settlement agreement. At the last meeting on March 1st, we introduced a zoning ordinance for Section 5.1 entitled Affordable Housing. This basically creates a framework for affordable housing in the Township. That is currently located on the website under affordable housing as well as proposed ordinances. We introduced the mandatory set-aside ordinance which is essentially making sure that any development, future development of the township that is over 5 units of residential includes a set aside of 20%. There was also a resolution on affirmative marking, which states that we will affirmatively market any affordable housing that's located in the township. In process, we're in the process of drafting a development fee ordinance, and certainly Beth McManus can touch on these a little bit more when she comes up next. We also are in the process of appointing an administrative agent that will oversee affordable housing in the township of Millburn. Upcoming as well is and not yet in process, is the overlay zones that are a part of the settlement compliance mechanisms, and will be explained by Beth here.
Thank you, Alex. Good evening, everybody. My name is Beth McManus. I'm the township's affordable housing planner, and I'm going to go through. Thank you. I'm going to go through quickly the other compliance mechanisms that will be included in the township's housing element and fair share plan, and that are already included in our settlement agreement. So what you see here is a map of Millburn Township that identifies all of our affordable housing sites.
Speak up a little, all right?
Yes, will do. Thank you very much. So what you see on this screen is a map of the township that identifies all of our affordable housing sites. And I will run through those very briefly this evening. And I do want to just highlight one thing that Alex said, which is that there's a presentation on the township website that was given earlier in the year, in about mid-January, that provides a much more detailed overview of these sites and other aspects of the settlement agreement. So this is intended to just be a summary of that. Millburn Township satisfied its affordable housing obligation through generation of what's referred to as a vacant land adjustment. And without going into the weeds on exactly what that means, is it's a downward adjustment of our obligation that is intended to reflect the amount of vacant and developable land. And there are a handful of mechanisms that I'll identify in just a moment that are specifically intended to meet that downwardly adjusted obligation, that RDP. There are additional mechanisms also identified on this map that are intended to meet the outstanding obligation, the difference between our total obligation and that RDP. And they are predominantly overlay zones and then a couple of other mechanisms. So with that in mind, let me start with the RDP mechanisms. So first we have Canoe Brook, which is highlighted on the map in orange. It's referred to as the Upton Canoe Brook. That's an existing development, meaning it's already been constructed. Folks are already living there. It's a total of 200 housing units, of which 30 are affordable. We also have the Silverman Group, or 85 Woodland Avenue. That is, thank you very much, that is also identified on the map in orange. That is a project that has been approved, but is not yet constructed. It's got a total of 62 units, of which 12 are affordable, and there's also some non-residential space as well that will be planned in the site. Additionally, we have what's called the Wells Fargo property. Yes, thank you. And that has a total of 53 units, of which 8 will be affordable. That project has also been approved, but is not yet constructed. And then next we have 249 Millburn Avenue. That's often referred to as the Annie Says property. That site has just been zoned. It's not yet had a site plan approval. And that will have a total of 150 housing units, of which 30 will be affordable. And then last but not least, for the RDP, we have a couple of group homes, existing group homes within Millburn Township. Those are actually not identified on the map. So what this means is that Millburn has satisfied its RDP, that adjusted obligation, using a total of 4 inclusionary housing developments, of which one of them is constructed and the other 3 are planned, either as in they've been approved by the planning board or will be approved or subject to an application in the future. And so in addition to these mechanisms that meet that RDP, Millburn also agreed to a handful of unmet need mechanisms. Those are the mechanisms that's the difference between the total obligation and that RDP. So first, let me just answer what might be on some folks' minds, which is what exactly is an overlay zone? And that is a type of zoning district that creates an option of development for a property owner or perhaps a future developer. It allows for the development that currently exists to remain. Folks can, if it's a commercial use, for example, can reoccupy stores, it can change tenants, it could expand, it can do any type of development activity that's currently permitted by the existing zoning. Or they can utilize that overlay zoning as an option. And the overlay zoning in each instance, and I'll go through in a little bit more detail, in each instance it permits inclusionary housing. So more specifically, that means if you own a store in one of these overlay zones, you can continue to operate in the store, you can expand your store, or you can have the site redeveloped for inclusionary housing consistent with the ordinances that will be adopted. So in all of these cases, for the overlay zoning, the zoning has not yet been adopted. These are actions, these are steps that will be taken in the next couple of months. So first for our overlay zones is it's called the C2 zone, but it's really the Canoe Brook Country Club, which we can see in the large C district. Thank you very much, Graham. That area will have overlay zoning at 8 units an acre and a 20% set aside. And that set aside, as you'll hear me say, is consistent throughout all of these zones. 20% of any of the units, housing units developed on the site must be affordable. So like I said in the explanation of overlay zoning as a golf course, this property owner, they have the right to continue to use the site as the golf course, to make changes consistent with that existing zoning on the golf course, or they have the option to have some or all of the site redeveloped with residential uses consistent with the zoning that will be adopted. Beyond that, we also have the B zone along Mars Turnpike. This area will be zoned with an overlay district to permit 18 units an acre and a 20% set aside. We also have the B2 district. It's specifically between Millburn Avenue and Myrtle Avenue. This area will be rezoned for a total of 40 units an acre with a 20% set aside. Next, we have the B4 district, generally the downtown area here, and that will be rezoned with an overlay to permit 25 units an acre and also a 20% set aside. Next, we have the CMO district in the southern part of the township. Thank you. And that area will be subject to an overlay district at 18 units an acre, and again, that 20% set aside. And then last for our overlay districts is the OR1 district, a portion of it in the northern part of the township, thank you. That area will be rezoned with an overlay district for 20 units an acre and a 20% set aside. And so in addition to these half-dozen overlay districts, there are a couple of additional mechanisms. The first one is the Woodmont properties site, highlighted again in the northern part of the township. This is not subject to an overlay district, but instead is subject to a rezoning that permits the property to be developed with 195 units, including 39 units of affordable housing. Now, I will say that zoning is effective upon the property owner receiving state agency approval because of its location and its ownership. It is required to receive permission from the State Property Review Board to actually be developed with residential housing. That is a burden that the property owner must take on to seek that approval. If they are successful, then the zoning will be effective. The next mechanism, as you heard referenced with Alex's introduction, is the mandatory set-aside ordinance. And that ordinance very simply captures any affordable housing opportunities that we haven't thought of or that the settlement agreement did not think of. If a property owner comes forward and they are successful in requesting, let's say, a use variance to permit multifamily housing where none is currently permitted, then they must provide an affordable housing set-aside. But it does not obligate the planning board, the zoning board, or the governing body in the case of any applicable request to approve the application. It simply states If it is approved, then it must include a set-aside. And then our last mechanism is the primary reason why we've gathered here this evening, and that is for redevelopment of a portion of the DPW or the 11 Main property. And with that, I'm going to turn things back over to you, Alex.
Thank you, Beth. Just before we get into the 100% affordable, and as we've gone over the compliance mechanisms and the settlement agreement, you know, Mayor Miggins and Committeeman Wasserman, who are here this evening, were involved in negotiating the settlement agreement, and I believe they just wanted to make a very brief statement while they had the opportunity in this public information session.
Thank you so much, Alex. Mayor, do you want to?
Sure, I'll come up.
Yeah.
My pleasure.
So I just wanted to I thought it would be an appropriate opportunity to give our residents some insight into the negotiations, because I think Beth did an excellent job of detailing the technical side of it. You know exactly what the settlement said. But I think as the mayor and I were the lead negotiators in terms of actually in actually making the settlement. So I wanted just to point out that as one of the negotiators, that we actually had some goals going into the negotiations. And our first goal, at least I don't want to speak for the mayor, but the first goal for me was to finally settle our affordable housing obligation, which the township did not address for many, many years. You can argue over the length of time. Number two, to fight for a fair settlement that dealt with our obligation and protected the township. Number three, to keep our densities as low as possible in order to protect our schools from overcrowding. As part of our agreement to build a 75-unit all-affordable building, we received a substantial discount in our densities from fair share housing. I would approximate about a 30% across-the-board reduction in many of our zones, but I would leave that to Beth McManus to go into the detail of exactly what we gained from that. And also, number four, to avoid losing our immunity, from the court. We were warned by our professionals that losing our immunity could have a devastating legal and financial repercussions for the township. This could have led to several builder remedy lawsuits, and as well as the court taking action to actually take control of part of our government, which has happened in other towns. So I just wanted to give people a little flavor of what it was like to sit across from fair share housing. The negotiations actually took hundreds of hours of, I would say hundreds of hours of negotiation, over the course of 2.5 or 3 years. And I just want to thank, our professionals for helping us make the deal. So with that, Mayor.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for coming out. This is terrific. And as Alex said, we are recording it so people will be able to see it, and we plan on having other meetings as well. This was not an easy thing to do, and as Richard said, what we thought was most important was to keep those overlay zones lower, and that is really, really important. If somebody could put 40 units on 1 acre of property, if we could get those numbers down to instead maybe 16 units on an acre of property, that property is not as valuable. So we thought it was more important to get those overlay zones lower, and therefore the way we did that was by doing the 75-unit building in the first part of the DPW. So we think that's really important. We also think it's really important that you realize that there are 5 members of the Township Committee, and every single member voted to do this. So you need to know that it was a 5-0 vote, that everybody voted for it, and that although we did feel we had our backs up against the wall, we felt we made the best deal that we possibly could, and we weren't controlling the cards, unfortunately. So we had to make the deal that we did, but it did get voted on 5-0. So we're very happy to report that. So we think that's really important that you're aware of that as well. And we have great professionals that have been working with us that will continue to move this process forward. And nobody likes change. Unfortunately, sometimes change is foisted on us. So know that we worked as hard as we possibly can for all of you in the town, and we're townspeople too, and plan on staying here a really long time. So with that said, Mr. McDonald.
So at this point in time, we're going to get into the DPW site, the portion of the site that's being utilized for 100% development. Graham Petto from Topology will run us through that and sort of the conversations that we had with Fair Share Housing about that site and the background on that site.
Good evening, everybody. Again, as Alex said, my name is Graham Petto. I'm a senior land use planner with Topology. We serve as the consultant planner for the township. Just as Alex said, I'm going to walk us through the concept plan approach that the township undertook in negotiating with Fair Share on the final concept for the DPW site. So currently shown on the screen here is the original concept plan that was developed for the property. This was presented at a public meeting of the township committee back in November. This was the original concept plan, kind of depicting the proposed building, at the at the eastern portion of the site of the DPW lot, frontage along Main Street and access from Essex Street. The DPW operations and building would remain and be reconfigured on the site under this proposal. And to the next slide. So next, I just wanted to talk through the concept feedback. So as I mentioned, the township submitted that original concept plan to Fair Share Housing Center and received these kind of 4 high-level responses from Fair Share in the negotiation process. The first was that Fair Share demonstrated some concern about the impact of the DPW operations and being too close to the proposed residential building. They requested that there be better buffering or separation of the DPW uses from the proposed residential building, as the uses are fairly inconsistent. They also requested that there be a greater setback from the rail right-of-way, so that there's less impact to the residents of the affordable housing development. And they also requested that the residential project have a dedicated access and not share a driveway with vehicular truck traffic that's going into the DPW site, so they can maintain their own safe, separate residential access. Next, we just want to touch on what are some of the current conditions at the DPW site. This is also what we're working with the township now to kind of identify existing uses at DPW that are going to need to be relocated from this site as part of the new development approach. So this is some drone footage that we took of the property. And just to kind of understand the scope of this site, Block 1207, Lot 9, which is the entire site, encompasses a number of different elements and components. As you can see, the property spans a great length along the rail right-of-way. The sections that we're predominantly talking about are 3A, 3B, and 4, as depicted on this graphic. So the current uses that are occupied on the portion of the site that contain the DPW include a small permanent parking lot, the salt zone storage area, the convenience center for recycling container drop-off for residents, some waste storage, material storage, the fuel station, and vehicular storage and plow storage at the site presently. On the opposite side, we have the DPW building, garbage truck parking at the rear, and the municipal vehicle storage and another parking area. Okay, so moving into the design proposal. So as I mentioned, under the original concept that was presented in November, we've overlaid the boundaries of that proposed site that was submitted to Fair Share originally. That was 1.46 acres in size. Remaining portion would be 2.55 acres to remain in DPW operations. We just wanted to note the alignment of features on the prior concept so you could see the impact of those features. And then here, this is, if we can pause here, this is following some kind of iterative process in response to Fair Share's concerns about the impact of DPW operations on the proposed building. The site was reconfigured and increased in size to 1.78 acres from 1.46 acres. We spent a significant amount of time speaking with DPW folks as well and officials to ensure that there would be sufficient circulation around the DPW building so that trucks could move in and out of the building and still maintain use of the facility to lessen the impact to the township. So this was the revised concept that was presented to Fair Share and kind of depicting the overlay of uses that will be impacted on the site. It's just reiterating. Again, just a review of the portion of the site to be used for DPW. Section 4 will move towards the affordable housing. Yeah, so I think that's all. And then, Alex, I don't know if you want to touch on this portion. Okay, I'm going to turn it back over to Alex. Thank you.
So in addition to the evaluation of the DPW site, certainly there was an environmental component to that and making sure that the site was suitable for development. We engaged a company called VHB, who did an assessment of actually the entire DPW site However, they identified areas of concern on this portion, the portion that would be developed under the 100% affordable project. Out of the areas of concern here, I believe there were 11. They tested all of those, drilled them, sampled them. In 4 of the areas, they tested them because there used to be an above-ground storage tank or an underground storage tank. Another 4 of the areas were tested as a result of historic fill. And 1 area, or 2 areas were tested because there used to be historically a railroad spur that ran into the DPW site back in the day. Of that testing, all of it actually came back clean with the exception of 2 test sites, and they were historical fill with some minor metals that have been identified. They are going to be further investigated through an RI by VHB. However, through this process, there's been no indication by VHB that there's any reason the site would not be able to be developed. At this point, we're just going to turn it briefly over to RPM to go through their presentation on the 100% affordable development, talk to us about them, and then we'll get into the Q&A period.
Hi everybody, I'm Joe Portelli. I'm a Vice President of Development with RPM Development Group, and we're a Montclair-based vertically integrated real estate company. And since 1986, we have been developing, building, operating, and managing a portfolio of a little over 4,500 units and growing throughout New Jersey. And most of the portfolio is here in Essex County, though we work all over the state. And we do specialize in redevelopment projects, both urban and suburban. Brownfield redevelopment, historic rehab, adaptive reuse. We have a wide variety of capabilities between our design team and our on-staff construction team. And I think we have a couple of projects here that we can highlight that shows you the kind of things that we've done in the past. Close to home, in recent history, we completed a 100% affordable project in North Caldwell, 50 units. Also part of a settlement agreement. When it comes to redevelopment and multi-phase redevelopment, our work in Franklin Township in Somerset County is a good example. Since the mid-2000s, we've completed 6 projects there and are working on future phases. Keep scrolling. Yeah, that slide there is our most recent phase. It's called Somerset Square. That's a mixed income project, so there are affordable units and market rate units there. We don't do just affordable. And we also do mixed use development. We have about 300,000 square feet of commercial space in our portfolio as well. And one of the things that we're most proud of is our expertise in green building. It's not something that, it's legitimate building. It's not flashy, solar panels everywhere. It's building a better building through insulation, energy efficiency, things that you can't really see. It's all behind the walls and in the envelope to just make a more comfortable, better performing building. And we do that in all of our projects. Since 2006, it's become a real niche for us. And in this example, this is the greenest building, most energy efficient building that we've done so far. And this is Westville Commons in Westville down in Gloucester County. It's a 65 unit senior building that Nicolay's worked on with us. And this is a net zero passive house building. And there are 4 or 5 design principles that define a passive house building, which we can talk about if you like. But this is a net zero building in that there's an extensive solar array to generate as much on-site renewable energy, and we've also worked to reduce energy consumption on premises so that the net result is as close to zero energy consumption as possible. And this last slide is just to give you a flavor of what we like to do inside our units. It's a typical setup for us. Every project has its own individual design, no cookie cutters, templates, custom design for every unit, every project, stainless steel Energy Star appliances. Like to get a little creative with the two-tone cabinets from time to time. So doing high quality housing and raising the bar is something that we always look to do. On the screen here is a very preliminary concept that we came up with based on the fair share housing framework that Graham reviewed. And I do want to mention up front that this is just preliminary in nature. There's still plenty of design and engineering to do as we go through the process. Should we reach a development agreement with the township. And so this fits the basic parameters of the settlement. It has 75 units. It has the appropriate mix of 1-bedroom, 2-bedroom, and 3-bedroom units. And I think I'd actually like to let Anthony speak more about the concept in a little bit greater detail.
Thanks, Joe. Good evening, everyone. I'm Anthony DiAugusta. I'm a partner with Inglace Architecture and Engineering. We're a full-service architecture and engineering firm, also in Essex County in Cedar Grove. Our collaboration with RPM goes back long before Joe and I were partners at our respective companies. We take great pride in making sure that affordable housing is not forgotten as part of general market building throughout the state. We've covered quite the portfolio ourselves. Every building that Joe shared tonight, we're proud to say we were the design team and executed, including Westville Commons, which I led the team on and had a great learning curve and really learned what it meant to deliver high-quality, energy-efficient housing. Our portfolio in general captures a great deal of RPM's work, and what we recognize is that the collaborative effort, both with ourselves and RPM, as well as the community, is something that is great for just general design. These designs typically are not straightforward. These are iterative. They take a series of steps, and as Joe mentioned, by no means is this the final design. This is but just one stop along the way. But that being said, the design itself, with topology's great oversight, kind of encouraged us to be respectful of the rail line, which was obvious, and obviously performing, or ensuring that there was performance allowed on both sides of the property, and fire protection services were provided. The L-shaped building, or this sort of odd-shaped polygon building, sort of sits above a parking garage, or some of it is exposed and some of it is beneath it. But by and large, what we were trying to do is adjust and maintain a massing that sort of was a bit more contextual to Old Short Hills Road. So the building that fronts the street is pulled off of the curb a bit, and that operates as a 3-story mass. And as the building sort of gets away from the street, it then rises up. So most importantly, the experience at the street or at the curb is feeling with the general design around downtown Millburn. The purpose here is making sure that this didn't seem overbearing on the street, so the building was pulled back a bit. As you can see, most importantly, we're pulling the building away from the DPW building. So the building itself is around 100 feet away from that property line, or from that building, and our property line itself sits 60 feet away from that building. So we're trying to be as conscious of our surroundings as possible. And as well, from this depiction, you can see that we're also providing a bit of outdoor space. At the second floor, the residents of the building will have an area to congregate and take advantage of southern solar path. That sort of inner core of the building will see sunlight for a good portion of the day. A great space to kind of get out and sort of host. Sometimes inviting some folks over and enjoying the outdoor area at a raised level. If we go to the next slide, we can kind of get an idea of what the programming is. An additional importance to us was ensuring that the ground floor remained active, and as you mentioned earlier, sort of this interface with the community and people in the area. What we didn't want was sort of utilities and sort of a blank wall along that frontage. It's important that this building sort of feels alive throughout the day and isn't just abandoned during business hours. Again, relating back to most of your downtown, that your retail spaces are alive during the day. So the front is an amenity space that would be occupied by both administration services for the building, as well as a flexible space for the residents at large. In general, this space would be complementary to the second floor space, sort of breakout space in days that where maybe going outside might not be as conducive. And this space is sort of accessible only to the residents of the building. There's a management office, an on-site super would operate this building. All RPM buildings have an on-site super. Ground floor towards the rear of the building, sort of off of the street, is sort of the mundane utilitarian spaces. We have a compactor and general utility space, sort of the boring end of the building. But as you can see, there's a fair amount of parking beneath that podium, as we call it. As we get up to the second floor, which is the next slide. This general floor plate is repeated for this floor and the next, with the exception of that terrace space at the second floor and an amenity space that sits just adjacent to it. Again, that amenity space complements that, of which is downstairs, but we sort of have this indoor space that allows you to enjoy the outdoor space and sort of this breakout. And then we line both sides of this shape with units on either side of the corridor. This is a generally typical double-loaded corridor, as it's called. And we have a mix of 1s, 2s, and 3s, 1 bedroom, 2 bedroom, 3 bedroom units spread across generally equally. As we go up to the upper floors, as I mentioned, that floor plate sort of repeats itself. There's common laundry facilities on each floor for the residents of the building. And then on the fourth floor, you can see that the mass of the building steps back, and we're pulling ourselves 45 feet off of our property line. And so from the street curb, it's more like 55, 60 feet. So again, that scale of the massing is reduced. And if we look at the rendering, you'll see that, again, this building operates more contextually as a three-bedroom, a three-story building with a setback a pretty good distance away. No worries. The material palette here is one that we felt was complementary to your brick-based masonry downtown. We were conscious to make sure that our building remained contemporary and also protected against durability. The masonry materials here at the tactile level stand the test of time, as seen with most of your buildings downtown. And the material palette generally balances out with cast stone anchoring the base of the building, a fair amount of fenestration. It's important to get light and air for our residents. It's a priority. And a bit of cast stone branding, breaking up the general facade of the building. What was really important to us was making sure that the massing didn't feel over-empowering and intimidating at the street curb. So there's a bit of undulation to the face of the building. There's a bit of volumetric play to sort of break up the monotony, if you will. As you can see from this perspective, there is a drive access on the left side of the building coming off of Short Hills Road, going towards the parking garage behind. And at the ground floor, again, it's sort of illuminated. This is a rendering, but this would sort of be how it's depicted most of the days, where that light is sort of keeping that ground floor active. And then the last slide sort of captures what's happening from a bird's eye perspective. Again, that massing along Old Short Hills is pulling off a bit at the fourth floor, and then that sort of U-shaped building kind of rounds the property. The terrace area is sort of tucked in there. You can see a bit of pergola and umbrellas, and then at the ground floor, you're seeing a fair amount of parking. Along the street frontage, we're making sure that there's a bit of green space. Again, pulling that building off of the street curb was important to us. I believe that's it from a design standpoint.
Thanks for the overview, Anthony. And again, I'll just recap or reiterate that this initial concept does hit on the fair share request in that design negotiation. So we're always going to set back the building as much as we can from Main Street or Old Short Hills while respecting the DPW buffers, the property setback, and also the building setback, which means there's likely going to be always going to need a fourth floor to achieve that density. We have the access from Main Street, and we have the setback from the rail right-of-way. So that's the framework for density and bulk, and we will refine this further as we go through the process. I was also asked to talk a little bit about what is 100% affordable housing. and can also talk about what it's not. Affordable housing, 100% affordable housing is housing for a range of household types and sizes for a diverse workforce here in New Jersey. Service workers, different types of professional workers. And we've got a bunch of numbers up on the screen, but I always think it's helpful to try to put that there are people behind these numbers, and you probably know and might even be close to people who would qualify for these units. And we're talking about pastry chefs, personal trainers starting out, people who work in city halls, county workers, state workers, healthcare workers, nurses, technicians, secretaries, admin professionals. So there are plenty of hardworking people who live in our units across the state. And when you think about low and moderate income housing in New Jersey, it's not, New Jersey, especially in northern New Jersey, incomes are rather high. The area median income for a family of 4 in Essex County is a bit over $100,000. So your starting point is rather high. And this table gives you a sense of the range of incomes that we intend to serve across 1-bedroom, 2-bedroom, and 3-bedroom units across household sizes. You could have an individual making as little as $16,000 a year, or a family in a 3-bedroom unit that could be making almost $90,000 a year. And these are the figures just based on the income limits currently published by HUD, the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. They do change every year. Sometimes they go up, sometimes they go down, and we tweak accordingly to match those income limits that are in effect. These rents in this program is consistent with the settlement agreement, which relies on something called UHAC. That stands for Uniform Housing Affordability Controls. It's a state regulation that you see applied to these COA, or municipal affordable housing projects. And we've got an added layer in here. We also follow the guidelines of the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program. That's a federal program administered by each state housing finance agency. In New Jersey, it's the New Jersey Housing and Mortgage Finance Agency. And so in every project we do, almost every project we do, we rely on those tax credits. And in this case, on our municipal settlement agreement projects, we see where those requirements intersect, and we design accordingly. A real quick note on what affordable housing is not. It is not a Section 8 project. There isn't one big rental assistance contract with HUD, though we do accept Section 8 vouchers. It's against the law to reject tenants just because they have a housing voucher. So as long as they meet your requirements that are otherwise in place, then you can accept Section 8 tenants. It is not public housing involved or run by a public housing authority in any way. This is or will be a completely privately run enterprise, 100%. There's government support and government oversight, but it's not government run. And it's also not easy to rent one of these apartments. It takes quite a bit of work to put together an application and go through the process. And for every 10 applications that we receive for a unit, 1 or 2 make it through. So there's quite a bit of work involved. Okay, this is a hot topic in many communities. How many children will live in this 100% affordable housing project? The shorter answer is, I can't say for sure. I do know that there will be children living here because it's a building designed for families. So my crystal ball isn't great. It's as good as anyone else's, but the best it can do at the moment is just look to some demographic multipliers coming out of Rutgers from a few years ago. There's one data set coming out of the Rutgers Center for Real Estate through the business school. And there's another data set coming out of the Blasting School for Planning and Public Policy. The business school study relies on a survey of owners and property managers, while the Blaustein study relies on census data from 2012 to 2016. So in this table, what we did here was just applied those multipliers from each study to the unit mix to see what kind of numbers it would generate. So there's school-age children, that's one figure, and then public school children, which is the portion of those children who are likely to be in the public schools. So for school-age children in general, the multipliers suggest as little as 48 children or as many as 55 children. And when it comes to public school children, the one set of multipliers projects 30 public school children, and the other projects 43 children spread across grade levels, K through 5, 6 through 8, 9 through 12. So this is just a projection based on the data that's readily available to us developers, planners, and economic development folks. There are studies by across the country by different states for different housing types, but this is the most relevant local data that we have. And could be more, could be less, could be right on, but just presenting the best info that we have, just for general indication.
All right, I promise we're about 3 minutes away from being completed so that we can for the Q&A. However, I just want to briefly turn it over to Joe Mariziti, who is, again, our attorney on development. And he's just going to briefly explain some of the mechanisms that can be used in this and also where we are in terms of the developer's agreement process or what's involved in a developer's agreement in general.
Thank you, Alex, and good evening, everyone. If you can't hear me, raise your hand and I'll know what that means. So all of this work that's gone to this point has led to the question of who is going to implement this project that has been negotiated for so long by so many experts here. And the city, the township rather, undertook a process, a competitive process, that included the issuance of an RFQ, to request for qualifications. There were 10 responses, and from those 10, 4 were selected to receive an RFP, a request for proposals. So there were 4 who submitted detailed proposals, one of which is RPM, as you just heard from this evening. A steering committee conducted interviews, resulting in a recommendation to the township committee that RPM be conditionally designated to be the developer of this project. I mentioned conditionally designated because the designation is not final. It is conditioned on several factors. One is that the court and Fair Share approve the plan. And now we've heard tonight from Graham about the different iterations of the plan, and the one that was the second version has, I understand, been accepted by Fair Share. So we're over that hurdle. The other condition is that we successfully negotiate a developer's agreement with RPM that will cover all the details of the project so that we will know what it is the township is going to end up with. Now, what are those, highlight of some of those issues are, certainly number one will be compliance with the terms of this hard negotiated settlement agreement that you've heard about this evening. A payment to the township for the acquisition of the property at a price yet to be negotiated, depending upon all the financial calculations that need to be done. There is incidentally a particular statute that permits a township, municipality of any kind to sell publicly owned property without a sealed bid process. If the property is going to be used to construct housing for low and moderate income families, residents, and if it is an urban regional entity. And so that's another condition of the designation, that there be an urban renewal entity that will execute this developer's agreement. An urban renewal entity is an entity that has a control on the income profits that may be obtained. So other issues that will be in the developer agreement will be a detailed description of the final design. These are proposals, I understand, a final design of the structure, the unit mix, parking, description of the amenities that will be provided, a description of the sustainability features. There will be financing provisions. There will be a project schedule that will be attached to the developer agreement. We will deal with issues concerning the operation of the completed project, the negotiation of payment of township costs, and a variety of other issues that will come to the table as we get into all the ones I just mentioned. Now, I indicated that the Township Committee voted to conditionally designate RPM, subject to the negotiation of this developer agreement. And there is one further element of that resolution, and that is that after the developer's agreement is negotiated, it is not final until it is approved by a separate vote of the Township Committee. So there will be another vote on the final version of the developer agreement, elements of which I just outlined. If there are any questions during the question and answer period, I'll be more than delighted to answer questions. Thank you, Alex.
Thanks, Joe. So just some next steps real quick. We are going to plan a session that's dedicated to the design of the 100% affordable development portion of the DPW site with resident input. We're going to set up a township email, or we're going to email attendees that have been here tonight, and if they're interested in attending a subsequent meeting. Also, additional information will continue to be posted at that portion of the website that I indicated at the beginning of this meeting. And please, certainly visit there or sign up for notifications on the township's website when things are added to that portion of the website, so you can be alerted when changes are made. With that, we're going to head into the Q&A. I know that's going to be an important part of this. Again, we're just going to ask that speakers limit their comments to 3 minutes to the best of their ability. If known, please address your question to who may be responsible. Again, we have planners, we have the developer, we have attorneys. So if you have a specific question that you know who it might go to, that's great. Otherwise, we'll figure it out. We'll have the right person answer it. Once you've completed your questions, the presenter will answer. We don't want to get into a big back and forth or debate at this point in time. We want to make sure that we can get through everybody and get to everybody's questions. Please limit your questions to a reasonable amount that could be answered. Getting up and sort of rattling off 10 to 15 questions is not really going to be conducive to us being able to answer them or us being able to get into a beneficial question and answer period. And just please be courteous in your approach. Again, we're here as a community to learn and educate ourselves about this process and make sure that we have an understanding of what the township is currently going through. And so just please be courteous. With that, if you just want to raise your hands, I'm going to have another mic somewhere. Yep, perfect.
Thank you. I think it was Beth McManus who in a previous meeting referred to supportive housing. And I think that's something that people overlook, that there are people in the community who have adult children who might be looking for supportive housing and are also interested in the agencies that manage that. So I'm interested in that component in this building, and are there other agencies who might get involved in the planning?
Sure. So I just want to highlight the fact that we do have some supportive housing units that we are using to meet our affordable housing obligations. So I highlighted those very briefly tonight and at the last presentation. We have 5 units of supportive housing that are meeting our obligation. Now, these are existing group homes in the community, and I think part of your question is about new supportive housing that might be created. But I just want to be clear that we do have those 5 units. And in terms of any supportive housing in this project, I'm going to defer and let RPM provide any commentary on that topic.
There will be a supportive housing component here. Calls for 5 units, and the target population has yet to be confirmed, but we've served a range of supportive housing tenants in some of our past projects. Developmentally disabled, physically disabled, homeless households, those with HIV or AIDS. Other populations include youth coming out of foster care or victims of domestic violence. The State Housing Agency has 6 or 7 different recognized target groups, and we've worked with a bunch of them. And sometimes other state agencies do get involved, like DHS, and the New Jersey Housing and Mortgage Finance Agency does have a supportive housing group as well. Work through design issues and rental assistance and service provision and linking tenants and owners with service providers like the Arc of Essex County, for example.
Next.
Are you still have to go through site plan approval process with your, okay, so I'm not going to get into stuff like traffic or curb cuts or any of that stuff, because you're going to go through that. I have a couple of questions. I guess they directed to you, on a general basis, since we have a third round coming up pretty hot and heavy, and some of the sites, like the Canoe Brook Golf Course, would probably sustain quite a number of units, but the likelihood of our getting that within the term of the third round is pretty slim, I'd say. So I guess my overall question is, why weren't there other sites, like maybe all of the dump site, considered in order to hedge our bets and give ourselves a buffer? Because now we're meeting our first and second round, but I don't see a buffer where we can easily meet our third round, aside from the fact that once you start developing the dump site, the DPW site, it makes a lot more sense, in my opinion, unless the rest of the site is contaminated, to do it all at once instead of doing it in, it's going to be more expensive to do it in separate slugs.
Okay, so there are a couple questions in there. So I think the first question is a little bit about the timing of projects and perhaps concern about the timing and how quickly some of these sites will be developed, like the country club, for example. So first, let me say, for all of those overlay zones, including but not limited to that country club, it is okay that they may not develop between now and the end of the third round, which is July 2025. That is okay, and frankly, that's expected. So in communities like Millburn, where you guys just simply don't have enough vacant land to satisfy your entire obligation, and I didn't say this during my part, but your whole third round obligation is 1,115 housing units. That is a huge number for a township that's basically built out like Millburn. And fortunately, the rules recognize that there are communities where they're going to find themselves in this situation. That's why we have that vacant land adjustment process that I talked about, where you can do this downward adjustment of your obligation. Now, that's relevant because with that downward adjusted obligation, there are different rules applied to meeting that RDP. So those sites that I went through, like the Upton, the Wells Fargo property, they have a different set of rules. For the unmet need mechanisms that are the overlay zones, the rules are a little bit softer on the timing. And it's such that the overlay zoning is required to be put in place. It's required to create a good opportunity for somebody to take advantage of. But if that property owner decides not to, that's all right. The township is not in danger of being found non-compliant. So I hope that...
No, I get that.
Okay.
It still doesn't answer my question, which is, but the whole dump is developable site, right?
Yeah.
So it would have been logical, I think, to have put that into the system earlier on. It could be built in phases. If there was some pressure to build the portion of it that's being built now, it could be built in phases. But to go ahead and designate that as a potential site and look at it caustically as to whether or not it made sense to maybe do all the site work at once and then develop it in phases. It's a huge site. It's one of the biggest sites that we have.
Well, so
The township settlement agreement, it was negotiated specific for those 75 units on roughly half of the DPW property. And that was done in the sense that a portion of the property, rather than the full property, was utilized so that it granted flexibility to the township, flexibility to accomplish the affordable housing that it has to move forward on in, we have 2 years essentially to have this project under construction. So flexibility to be able to move that forward while having additional time to plan if or how the township wants to address the remaining DPW facility. Because one of the things that this plan allows for is for the affordable housing to be built while the DPW facility continues to operate. And so with that negotiation, we have that flexibility to decide either as part of this process or in the future if or when the rest of the DPW site will be vacated and redeveloped. And that's really critical, because one of the things we don't have flexibility on is, quite frankly, telling the court that, well, we can't move forward on this affordable housing site because we can't create a new location for DPW. That DPW site is really cannot serve as a barrier to the production of affordable housing. Otherwise, we endanger Millburn's immunity from builder's remedy litigation, and we endanger our compliance. So this plan that the township has put together as part of its settlement doesn't preclude future redevelopment of the DPW. It just simply doesn't require it. It gives the municipality the flexibility to make that decision about if and when it wants to have that other roughly half redeveloped.
Just one more quick question. I think it was Alex who mentioned that that tests have been done. If it turns out that more hazard contaminated soils are discovered, whose responsibility for the cleanup and the cost of it? Is it the townships or is it the developers?
I think, and Joe, you can tell me if I'm wrong, but I'm going to say that's going to be subject to the developers agreement negotiation that the township does with the developer.
Correct.
I'm Elaine Becker. I live on Brookhaven Way, and I want to mention something first about the site up there at Canoe Brook. I don't know if Ms. McManus is aware of the fact that the Buried Valley Aquifer is why the clubhouse is where it is, and why that is a golf course. If there's an aquifer underneath, the golf course is not going to have any effect on it. But when you start talking about housing, having an aquifer under there may be a need for more research on that piece of property. I don't agree that it should be such a huge overlay in that particular location. The other thing I wonder about is the Fair Share Housing Center. That is an advocacy group, and yet they seem to have so much power, more power than a municipality, where we have had our own land use law in our township since 1976 when it started, and we have built the town that we wanted, and now it seems like it doesn't matter. The people who live here and work here, and New Jersey has been a home rule state, and yet that seems to have gone away. We don't care about that anymore because the courts are now taking over, just giving us a number. And if you look at our map, it's a lot easier to see the color of the map in every single square inch of this town. And it's not right to just say, we need 1,000 more. Where are you going to put 1,000 more? You want to have a big fire somewhere maybe? And oh goody, then we can put some new houses there. I mean, I just don't understand some of this, that I know there is a need for housing. I'm not denying that, of course. But anyway, that's what I think about a lot of times when we get to this subject. So I think that's probably, the other thought might be, yes, I have one more thought. I am concerned that our township is going to turn into an urban township, and I don't think that's what we were ever meant to be. If you knew about our history, which I won't get into now, but it's certainly was never intended to be such an urbanized place. And all of our schools have been developed, have had additions on them. Every one of our public schools, more than once, some of them. And I think if we get too many more, of course we know the population in the schools goes up and it goes down and goes up again and down. So maybe if there's a downside, everything will be fine, but then we might have to go up again, which could be a problem. But that's not something we can all deal with this particular issue. But anyway, I think I said what I wanted to get out to you. Thank you.
Of course he didn't get it, he wanted to get me. Elaine, thank you. I'm John Scharf, 11 Oakland Road in Short Hills. I think there's a bigger issue over here, and it's kind of an overview of what we want as a town and what to expect as a town. The number of apartments just on the books is 735 new apartments. And our town population, according to census, is about 20,000 people. 735 will bring in easily 1,500 more people. Nobody's really thought this thing through in terms of what traffic would be, how livable this town is going to be, what the schools are going to be, and frankly, I'm from Brooklyn. I know what an urban area looks like. And if I wanted an urban area, I would have stayed in Brooklyn. And some people here would have wanted me to stay in Brooklyn, but regardless of that, this is being done in the most nilly-willy way possible. And I really do blame the Township Committee. They're just driving towards more housing. There are towns in New Jersey that have more housing. And it's not what we want. It's not how we live here. We already have a lot of traffic going down Old Short Hills Road. Our schools, some of them are at capacity, and we're always jostling kids from one school to the other. It's unfair to the kids, it's unfair to us, and frankly, with the low-cost housing, costs and expenses would be foisted on us. To your point about schools, I remember when the Upton was in planning phase, and I went down to a meeting, and one of the fine township consultants swore on a stack of Bibles there would be no more than 15, 16 kids. You can't imagine possibly anything more than that coming out of that building. Substantially more have come out of that building and have crowded the elementary school, the middle school, and the high school. So I think more study, more analysis needs to be done. Traffic, density, services, costs, everything needs to be presented to us. We're in this town. Some of us have been here for decades or more. And the thought of this thing all of a sudden becoming this urban area, I think is untenable for most of us. This is not the town that we're not getting the benefit of our bargain. Good balance.
Alex, those two. Can I get the mics?
Yes, moving around.
My name is Rajesh, and I live in 17 Vinesink Road, Fargo. So one of the things is always I hear from the director, from her, everyone. Everyone is scaring shit out of us that it's illegal, legal, legal. Everyone is only scaring us. That's not a good way from city and everyone to scare people that okay, it's legal. We know that affordable housing is required, but in any of the meeting or any discussion, I have not seen anything, what will be the consequence of it. No discussion on consequence of it. The simply thing is legal, we have to do it. But what will be the consequence? That gentleman has put so many points, but in any meeting, any discussion, there was nothing about consequence. Whether this developer is developing it, what will be the consequence? Any decision our city is making, make sure that all the residents' interests are included in that. We are part of the city. We have selected township committee members just for ourselves. If they are not taking our side, then that's not good. And whatever be the case, let's discuss the consequence of it. Whatever we are doing, we want some numbers. That okay, what you said 42 children, that's totally wrong. Believe me, after 1 year it will become, and if someone will say, even 10% no, they are 20%, 25% wrong on that number. Because what studies here shown, I can see that the data was totally flawed. So my only request is, with the township committee, is that okay, let's discuss the consequence of it. If we have to do it, then do it, but what will be the consequence? So that all the residents can feel comfortable living in this area.
Hi, Diane Eglow, 40 Greenwood Drive, Millburn. Mr. Wasserman said in his opening remarks that the Fair Share Housing can take control of our government, and that's happened before. I have been on the Township Committee. I have never heard that. You said, Alex, that there was core sampling of the entire DPW site? Just the site, okay, I just want to make sure. But as of now, most of the DPW site will be moved, and we don't really have a plan for that I have been told in the cost. So I agree with my neighbor sitting next to me that, and I've said this, that we should be looking at the entire site, because the entire site will have to be developed. And as far as the site was extended from 1.4 to 1.78 acres. Now, RPM was not selected unanimously from all 5 committee people, and I believe that's because there was another plan out there, and all 4 finalists should have been able to resubmit their RFP, because RPM's plan has no green space, and there's a lot of other concerns with it. And if it's not the finished, done and deal plan, then why are we not looking at what the other submissions were? Will the township be interviewing multiple financial analysts? Because this is a very complicated process. So I hope that we, and I am on the steering committee, we will be interviewing multiple financial analysts to give us the best idea of how this is going to be working out for us. Let's see. Oh, I thought each unit would be having a washer and dryer. I guess that's not true. 1 washer and dryer. Next question to RPM. Your depiction shows all brick. Is that a guarantee that building would be all brick? It will not have vinyl siding on what's not on the street?
I can make a commitment to no vinyl siding, yes.
What? Okay.
Yep.
Say my 2 cents here, thank you. Well, I want to echo what this gentleman, I didn't catch his name, Mr. Sharp from Brooklyn, said about the consequences of not doing enough planning. I mean, I'm probably one of the older people in this audience, and I think most of us aren't kids, and we weren't born yesterday. I think we all know what can happen if planning isn't done. If we don't figure out what are the traffic patterns on Old Short Hills Road as it goes into Main Street, and I'm not even counting in the summer, from May to November or whenever it is that now we shut part of Main Street off, and everybody has to go in a circle just to get where they have to go. And during the school months, people coming from Springfield area up Old Short Hills or back the other way, the traffic is a nightmare getting through town now. I don't even know if anyone's counted how many cars go up and down that street at peak times. So the traffic thing was touched on by Mr. Sharp, but it's a huge issue in this town. You can't get around in this town. That's, to me, the biggest issue. But there are other planning considerations that this gentleman brought up, and I just think that the whole thing, the way it's been described, that 5 people on our township committee would push their backs up against the wall so that no planning was done, and then they had to rush to find a developer, and I have nothing against this developer particularly. I don't really know anything about them. It's just, this thing is being sped through. and it's a big deal. Who's going to negotiate? How much money are we going to get from the developer? How's that going to be decided? Who's going to decide that? What's going into our coffers for selling this prime real estate? And the last thing I'll say is, you know, the developer showed us some really nice buildings that they've done out in the boondocks of New Jersey and out on properties that look like they were kind of empty and not near a town center. I might be wrong, but I don't think any of them are like scrunched into a property that's right on a main street that has, it's such a jammed artery right now. None of them look like that. They look like, you know, the condos you see that are out in the country somewhere if you want to live somewhere quiet and not in a little town like Millburn. We're a little town here, a small town. We're not giving you a big property out in the boondocks. So that's what I want to say is that I feel like we're going to bring something on ourselves if we don't do better planning here.
Okay, before we move on to the next, is there anything that the group wants to comment on that was stated? I just want to make reference to that only the portion of the site that was that is looking to be developed currently was tested, was bored to do those soil samples. Although what I did indicate was that they provided areas of concern throughout the entire site. However, the only things that were drilled were on the current site that is going to be developed. Is there anything that anybody would like to add at this point? I know the gentleman had said something about consequences, and I know we've repeated sort of over and over again the idea of voters' remedy lawsuit and what happens when you lose immunity or compliance. So I don't necessarily want to get into that, but certainly what we will do in terms of following this is listen to everybody's comments and see if there's things that we can provide additional context to or additional information to. All right, anyone else?
Dennis Fabian, 1 Barbary Lane. I'd like a couple questions answered. Who does the Fair Share Housing Center represent?
They are a nonprofit organization.
They're a 501c3.
So their mission is to assist, is to not represent as in legal representation, but their intention is to represent the interests of low and moderate income households.
So how do they gain access to all of these towns? And I know you've been involved in multiple townships. How do they gain access to the negotiations?
So without going through the very chaotic and detailed history of the third round, let me just do it very quickly. So we have a state agency, Council on Affordable Housing. Their mission, pursuant to our New Jersey Fair Housing Act, is to publish affordable housing obligations for municipalities, and then to write rules for how towns can satisfy those obligations, and then to review and approve housing plans. And they did that generally through the 80s, the 90s, a little bit into the 2000s. And then in 1999, the third round started. Second round ended, third round started. What was supposed to happen? COA issued rules. They didn't. They did it in 2004. Those rules got overturned from several challenges. They tried again in 2008. The rules again were overturned. They were involved in litigation for many, many years. During that time, particularly, or most relevant, post-2008, Fair Share Housing Center, which is perhaps the most prominent organization that's pushing to advance affordable housing in New Jersey, took COA to court and said, I'm going to very much paraphrase, but they basically said, hey, court, your state agency is not doing its job. It doesn't appear as if it's willing or able to do its job. And they said that through a series of litigations. And finally, in 2015, our New Jersey State Supreme Court, in what's often referred to as the Mount Laurel 4 decision, it's the decision that kicked off this process in New Jersey. That Supreme Court decision basically said, COA is a non-functioning state agency. Municipalities, you can't trust you can't wait for the state agency to issue numbers, issue rules, and review your housing plans. You, the municipalities, now have to go through court. Now, that's relevant to your question because that litigation was brought and pushed by Fair Share Housing Center. They were advocating, there were the parties in the case, bringing the case before the New Jersey Supreme Court. And so when they did that, they were, and I have enough attorneys here to correct me if I don't quite get this right, but as a result of their role in that litigation, they were essentially granted interested party status in every single municipal litigation, every single municipal action like Millburn's, which was, you know, where municipalities basically said, hey, court, I want to comply, I want to satisfy our affordable housing obligation. As soon as they did that, Fair Share Housing Center became an automatic interested party in your litigation. And so that's how they are automatically included in every municipality's case.
Who pays them?
They're a nonprofit organization.
Baloney. All right, here, I'm going to tell you right now. I have followed this now for the past 6 to 8 months. You, some of these attorneys, the builders, and the Fair Share housing people are all involved with all of these projects. This is a self-sustaining cabal. Self-sustaining. It doesn't go away ever because you're all involved with each other continuously. There are no new people getting involved in these projects. The Fair Share Housing Center can't possibly survive unless there are big contributions made from the towns, from the attorneys, and from the builders. This is how this whole thing works. If they are a 501c3, I want to know where their money comes from. If it's not coming from the state, who is contributing to keep them going? All right? They are an extortionist group. They come in, and I'm telling you this, they come into these towns, they tell you you need 1,000 units, but you can settle for 300 if you give us this much money. How much money did the Millburn Township Committee give to Fair Share Housing? How much?
It's not enough. Nothing. We got to give more in our obligation then, right?
So,
Exactly.
part of the settlement agreement is a fee, and maybe this is part of how they are paid for it, but part of the settlement agreement is a fee from the municipality of $85,000 for legal fees. Wow. Hold on one second. Hold on one second. The developers that are involved in that are required to pay 1/3 of that fee.
It doesn't matter.
I'm sorry.
I'm not finished. I am not finished yet.
I'd like to correct.
I'm not finished yet. I want to finish my statement. Because I'm being interrupted. First of all, that money is being extorted from towns, and the builders kick in. The towns do not have really a say in this. We have an attorney up here who's representing the town who 4 years ago represented this builders group. Tell me there's not something else going on here. This is a self-sustaining group.
Real quickly, I just want to make one correction. So, yes, the builders are contributing towards the township's obligation for that payment towards Fair Share Housing Center, but the builders are providing 2/3 of that payment. And so as a result, Millburn provides 1/3. The last thing I'd say is, in regard to funding from Fair Share, I'm sure they have public filing statements, but for folks that are concerned about the lack of control over this process by the municipalities and involvement of other parties, I would encourage folks to reach out to your state legislatures, because what we need is our state to take action to correct this situation for the 4th round. The 3rd round, as I said, ends in July 2025. If nothing happens between now and then, we will be doing this essentially, hopefully a more streamlined version of it, but essentially the same process all over again in 2025. If you think something should change, please reach out to the governor or your legislatures to seek a change with Council on Affordable Housing and or the Fair Housing Act or some other way to address affordable housing in New Jersey.
One question.
Hold on, excuse me. Exactly.
Jay Morelli, 1 Claremont Drive. And I want to start by thanking everyone for holding this meeting and answering the questions from the public. I think Ms. McManus stated at the beginning, and my questions are going to pertain to the overlay zones, and very specifically to the B2 overlay zones. As I understand it, the settlement does not include the terms, the ordinances that will impact the overlay zone, specifically items such as building heights, setbacks, green space, buffer zones, parking requirements, servicing requirements, rooftop decks, noise, and other requirements. My first question is, who is going to be drafting these ordinances? Will that be Ms. McManus? Will that be Mr. Petto? Will that be our lawyers? Will that be Mr. McDonald? Who is going to be actually drafting these? What will be the process for determining and ultimately approving these ordinances? What is the timing? My understanding is that the settlement gave us 120 days to produce those ordinances, and the clock has already started ticking on those 120 days. And who is ultimately responsible for the process? Is that the town committee? Is that the court? Is that our lawyers? Are there any legal reasons that this process could not include representatives of residents or residents themselves, especially those with property bordering near or on the overlay zones? I assume this group here is familiar with the Millburn zoning ordinances. Should we expect something like the R8 apartment zoning that's used in the garden apartments on Woodland Road and across from the high school? Is that the kind of ordinance, the setbacks, the building heights that we should expect? The density is very similar to the proposed density in the B2 zones. Will the overlay zones permit 1 or more floors of commercial use? And if that's the case, will we end up with 4 or 5 or 6-story buildings in the B2 because you've got multiple floors of commercial and the multiple floors of residential? And for those that don't know, the B2 zones are sometimes within 20 feet of the backyards of single-family residential homes. Going back to the question of resident involvement, I'll leave you with a quote from Mark Pfeiffer, who is a New Jersey municipal government expert at the Blaustein School, which was mentioned earlier at Rutgers, when asked a question on whether municipalities that have open dialogue with their residents on fair share housing issues fare better than those with closed processes. He said, "I think getting open communications with their community becomes really important, and giving citizens the opportunity to be heard and hearing from all sides in a respectful manner is important." So I encourage all of those that are responsible for this process to include resident participation in the drafting of these ordinances.
That's it. Yeah, I'm going to let them have an opportunity to touch on that. Maybe.
Yeah. So it's going to be a two-person answer, and I'm going to start. So in terms of the timing, you're correct that we have 120 days to complete our tasks for this compliance. So we have 120 days relative to this question to have the ordinances adopted. Yes, the clock has started. In terms of who is responsible for putting this work together, I'm actually going to let Graham answer that. But one thing I do want to highlight is the fact that at a minimum, this is sort of a team effort on the part of professionals, the township, and the residents of the community, in the sense that it's the professionals that must work together to put together an ordinance that meets all of the criteria, both planning criteria, legal criteria, and township committee to
to do the adoption process, that it certainly has to partner with the planning board in that adoption process for the ordinance introduction, master plan referral, and then, of course, the public hearing. But for additional details on this, I'm going to defer to Grant.
Thank you. So I don't want to, obviously the ordinance has not been drafted to this point yet. And obviously, your comments are very, very important. This does need to be a process that recognizes the existing value of the existing ordinances here in the Township of Millburn, while also respecting the requirements set forth in the settlement agreement. So any contemplated modifications to the zoning ordinance will, of course, need to be grounded both in the existing master plan reexamination report goals and objectives, within the master plan guiding documents also, and also respect existing buffer requirements, screening requirements that are within the existing zoning ordinance as well. Millburn has a great ordinance with a lot of requirements. The B2 zone, for example, has a significant rear buffer requirement. I think that should be respected, and maintained going forward. It's going to be a process, and it's going to be part of a public process. The township has a zoning subcommittee that will help, guide the development of the ordinance and review that. There will be an introduction, as Ms. McManus mentioned, at the township committee. The planning board will hold a public meeting at which they will review the draft ordinance for consistency with master plan and consistency with the established character of neighborhoods to make sure that it is respected and maintained. There will also be an opportunity, should the chair choose, to allow public comment. I think that should be something that is incorporated during that process. And then the ordinance will go back to the back to the township committee with a report from the planning board on whether it's consistent. And the township committee, during their proceedings, during the second read, will have a public hearing process at which residents can also provide input and offer suggestions or modifications to the ordinance as presented. So there will be a broad public process. The ordinance amendments, obviously, as I mentioned, have to respect the requirements for density within the settlement agreement. But I think from our perspective and from looking through the township planning documents existing, we need to respect what's on paper now and make sure we balance maintaining preservation of our existing neighborhoods in context of what's required.
So what I heard you say, let me respond, because a couple questions weren't answered. Number one is there any legal prohibition on resident involvement? And we've heard in the past that there have been court orders that have kept things secret from the public. I want to know right now, is there any legal reason that the public, that residents cannot be involved in that process?
So, again, I'm not speaking as an
We
attorney.
have a lawyer right there.
The question is there a legal prohibition against the members of the public participating in the planning and adoption of the ordinances? And this is different than the situation you referred to when the settlement was being negotiated. That was a different situation, and that was where it was confidential. I wasn't involved in any of that, but I'm generally familiar. Mr. Buzak can correct me where I'm wrong about that.
So the answer is
Excuse me,
no
I'm just going to ask that people don't call out. We're going to be here for, going back and forth on everything. Let them answer. If you want to rebut one more time, please do so.
The adoption of ordinances have mandatory public participation portion. So it's been referred to that there will be referral to the planning board to review the draft ordinances, and the purpose of the planning board is to determine whether they're consistent with the master plan or are designed to implement the intent of the master plan. That will go back then to the township committee, and they will introduce the ordinances if they have not already, and there will be a public hearing. Those are mandatory requirements. Now, I think your question is to go beyond that in some way. And there's no legal rules about that. That's a different story I can't talk about or comment on as a lawyer. That's a policy question.
Very good. So let me close by saying then, there was a restaurant ordinance that was passed 9, 12 months ago. The only public comment that was given was 3 minutes that was allotted during the town hall meeting. I implore this group of people sitting at the stage to involve residents earlier and in the process, take their input. Don't limit it to the 3 minutes that's given in the formal session. Thank you very much.
Can you hear me all right? Dave Cosgrove, 99 Oakview. I think I have 3 questions, they're relatively short, and I think all 3 probably can be answered by the planner, but the last one, Mr. Buzak may have to weigh in on. So looking at the settlement agreement, paragraph 9, which is the paragraph that deals with the new overlay zones. There are 5 new overlay zones, trust me on that. And I'm wondering why the numbers are different in those overlay zones. Canoebrook's got a different overlay density. Some B2s have another density. Who selected those and who decided why those certain areas should have a higher density or a lower density? The next question I have is on the paragraph 12, which is the town yard, the paragraph that deals with the town yard project. And my question is, was that paragraph explained to the members of the TC before they voted on it? And then the last question was, there's been comments over the last months and even including tonight I should say, by the TC members that their backs were up against the wall when they had to vote on this because the judge had set some unrealistic deadlines. And it seems like sometime in the middle of July of this year, something happened in the lawsuit that caused the judge to drop the hammer on the town. And I'm curious as to what event that was that generated that short time frame. Thank you.
I just need a third hand. So yeah, I am going to defer that last question to Mr. Buzak, but let me take the first 2. Your first question was, why do we have different densities in our overlay zones? And I think really what was the reasoning behind all of that and who selected it, essentially. So the short answer is that all of this was negotiated with Fair Share Housing Center. It wasn't, I think I can say definitively that these overlay zones and these sites were not ideas that the township put forward as what it thought it would like to do in order to meet its affordable housing obligation. These were these are overlay zones that were in part identified by Fair Share Housing Center to begin with. One of their roles in this process when they sense a municipality may be struggling with how to settle is to put forward ideas that they would recommend be included in the settlement agreement. And I think that was how many of these overlay zones started. And so the process is essentially ideas are put out there, and then once negotiation starts, it begins to negotiate, well, exactly how much land do we need, what densities can we settle for, etc. And I'm very reluctant to get into the details of those negotiations because it was subject to our mediation with Fair Share. But the final settlement of these densities, like the Canoebrook Country Club at 8 units an acre and say the OR district at 20 units an acre, they were ultimately supported by the Township Committee, I think, one, in an effort to settle with Fair Share and to maintain its immunity from builder's remedy, but also it was part of the larger discussion about our unmet need obligation as a whole, which can't be divorced from the DPW site, the 11 Main property. One of the goals that you heard our council people discuss this evening is the desire to keep densities down as much as possible. And clearly, when you look at this at these densities for these overlay zones and other sites, there were, I think it's fair to say there were sort of limited options because these densities are quite a bit higher than I think folks would have loved to see in a perfect world. So I know that's not a straight answer. I really can't go through the details of the negotiations and the mediation with you, but I can tell you that these sites are selected through that negotiation process, and the densities and the areas were done with the township's best efforts to keep those principles in mind, which was to reduce density in the municipality to the extent possible, given the options that were on the table and the need to maintain our compliance, or our immunity.
But can I just jump in real quick? Is that I do recall as part of those negotiations, first and foremost, that those densities in the overlay zones were significantly higher, as Committeeman Wasserman has alluded to. And there was a real concern going through that, that there was going to be, that we may be incentivizing development of those particular overlay zones. And so the reduction in those overlay zones was a part of that conversation and sort of certainly a goal of that negotiation as well.
And I think your second question that I can answer was, essentially, were the terms related to the DPW site, were they explained to the Township Committee? And certainly, that was one of the most heavily negotiated settlement terms or paragraphs in this settlement agreement. It was one of the items that the final negotiations really hinged upon, because it was one of the final pieces to the puzzle. So, certainly. And then for that...
Sorry, I also think that it's an extremely vague question. If there's a particular term of that, that you may feel like the committee approved that, you know, they didn't necessarily look at whether it was the fine for not proceeding, you know, or whatever it was. I think maybe more specificity in it would be helpful. But
It's just about the fair share. It's just about the 75 units.
Okay.
You think I know the answers of those?
Yeah.
And then your last question was, which I think was, what happened in mid-July that caused the rush? And so, thank you, Mr. Buzek.
There was no singular event that caused the court to establish the deadline of July 30th. This case has been going on since 2018. The court held several case management conferences over that time period. The court was kept aware of the mediation results by the special master, and the court simply would extend the township's immunity from third-party builder remedy lawsuits while we were negotiating. He did that for short periods of time over that 2.5-year period or 3-year period. And as we got into the summer of 2021, the court extended immunity to July 30th and said that if this case was not settled by then, it would come to trial. It first said in October 2021, trial date. I think it was may have been moved to November at some point. The indications were, as we saw it, that we were going to have trouble getting immunity extended. So the township doubled down and worked hard to get this matter settled. And during the course of that meeting on July 30th, which was a Friday, started at 9:30 or 10 o'clock in the morning, we spent the entire day and finally got it resolved late that day.
However, just to add to that, although it was resolved in terms of the township side, the other parties to the settlement agreement did not sign. As you were aware, we've kind of gone through the timeline a little bit. But nobody executed the settlement agreement except for the township on July 30th.
Alex, there are signed pages by every party on the site. On the
18th of August?
Yeah, that's
Yes.
July.
Well, and July.
No, the 18th of August.
Okay, well, we can discuss that at a different time.
I have the signature pages.
Hi, I'm Jean Pasternak. I'm a resident of Hobart Avenue. I just want to start off and clarify one thing. I have been in touch with former Mayor, Mary McNett. She really contests what Mr. Wasserman stated at the beginning of the session. Her statement is, the township always complied with all our affordable housing obligations. The proof is that there were no builders' remedy lawsuits ever filed against the township until the Township Committee failed to file our fair share plan in time. As I recall, Ms. Cheryl Burstein was the mayor at that time. It was a Democrat majority on the township committee. That is what created this mess and allowed builders to control our development. So I just wanted to put that out there as a counter to what Mr. Wasserman had to say this evening. My question is, you see how many brilliant people we have in this community speaking tonight, have spoken at township committee meetings. I found it absolutely astounding that we waited till after this agreement was signed and voted upon before this type of session was convened. Mr. Buzak, you stated that the judge forbid residents to be involved in being shared details with and allowing to ask questions. And he disputed that, and your response to that was it was a miscommunication on your part. I just want you to, at some point, tell us, that is a profound miscommunication. It kept us all out of having a say in what was decided. I think you owe us an explanation. I really hope you'll give us one this evening. A second question I have is, who's going to pay for all the infrastructure costs associated with the developments that are in the affordable housing settlement? Who's going to pay for the additional school expansion, the sewers, the police, everything that is going to go with an expansion in our population? Where are those costs going? Are there any developers that will be contributing, particularly to our schools, but any other infrastructure costs? Are there any feasibility studies being done, have been done on our traffic, congestion, pollution, noise, school expansion? If they have been, can you cite them and can we see them? I just want to get to an issue about conflicts. I understand that Mr. Buzak is both representing us as the Fair Share Housing attorney as well as our planning board attorney. Has any other township had someone represent them in those two capacities? Is anybody aware of that? I'd also like to understand a little bit more about how developers, I think one in particular, I think the range of those overlays goes from 8 to 40 per acre. One of the members of the 40 per acre density was a significant contributor to a campaign, at least one campaign that I'm aware of the township committee member. Does that represent a conflict? Have you seen that happen in other townships? The last general question I have is, what happened to the planner that we had here for 20 years? Why did he disappear 2 weeks before the affordable housing settlement was done when he was working on this for years? So those are my more general questions. I have quite a few for RPM because we couldn't get to them at the township committee meeting when I think Ms. Miggins promised that the public could ask specific questions, but we never got to. So will we be able to do that too? Or?
Sure, we'll come back.
Okay, thanks.
So, Ms. Pasternak asked quite a few questions in that. Is there anybody that would like to address any of those? Ed, Beth?
I can address a couple of those questions. With regard to the township's compliance in the past, the township never participated until 2018 in the COA affordable housing process. That Fair Housing Act was adopted in 1985. The first set of rules became effective in 1987. It was not until 2018 that the township filed anything with the Council on Affordable Housing.
That was 4 days late, right?
In fairness to Ms. McNett, the township did do certain things during that period of time, but they did not obtain any kind of judgment of compliance or repose in the courts or substantive certification from the agencies that make those determinations that you are in compliance. There's a process. The township did not participate in it. With regard to the confidentiality issue, and this is going to be the last time I'm going to address this issue, The special master wrote a letter or a memo to the township committee. It was read, I believe, in full by the administrator to explain the process and what was confidential, that all of the mediation sessions were confidential. He explained why that was, and repeating it is not going to make a difference here. That's the reason that the township committee was prevented, and the representatives who were in the negotiating team were prevented from disclosing matters that were discussed in mediation. And those matters were, for all intents and purposes, the settlement agreement that was finally disclosed once it was approved by everybody.
Can we just not go back? You've asked a bunch of questions.
No, it's not a question. I just want a clarification. I did not talk about mediation. I talked about the settlement that was agreed, and that's not what Mr. Buzak just addressed.
Okay, thank you. No. Let them answer the questions. You've asked questions. You want them answered? We're answering.
There were a couple questions on feasibility studies, who pays for infrastructure, things like that. And I think I can shed a little bit of light on that. So for physical infrastructure, things like roads, sewer lines perhaps, the developers, as they come to the planning board for their site plan approval, they will be required to provide any upgrades in that infrastructure that are necessary as a result of their application. So they essentially have to, no pun intended, but they have to pay their fair share towards that infrastructure. So if that means that a sewer line needs to be improved or a road needs to be widened as a direct result of this project being built, then the developer is responsible for those infrastructure upgrades. For the other types of infrastructure that you mentioned as part of that question, or perhaps the other question, things like police, schools, etc. Inclusionary projects are treated just the same as all other types of projects, whether you're building a 100% affordable housing project, or perhaps an inclusionary project, or perhaps a bank. The municipality is not able to provide, or rather require, that same fair share or that same pro rata share for improvements to perhaps the police force or the school system. That is simply, those are types of impact fees that are not permitted here in New Jersey. So we're not able to tell RPM as an example, and not to pick on team guys, but we're not able to tell these guys that you need to now pay for an additional police officer. And it's the same thing for somebody that would come in and build a new shopping center. We can't tell them, now you need to pay for a new police officer because the additional stores may generate that need.
I think it's also important to note that with the exception of perhaps this development, none of the other developments that are described in compliance mechanisms have pilots. So they will all pay taxes based on their assessed valuation, which certainly contributes to our ability as a municipality to budget for, if there is a need that exists, additional police officers, additional firefighter, a ladder truck to get to any of those expenses that do come up. For those that may or may not know, the Upton, which was one of those, the first affordable housing developments, inclusionary, in the township, that has a $100 million assessment, or $80 million assessment. So we receive taxation revenue from them, and certainly there is a split to the school and the county that is part of that as well.
And there were a couple of questions on conflicts. In terms of any conflict related directly to Millburn, I'm not familiar with that situation. I don't want to provide commentary on something that I'm not familiar with. But in terms of who represents municipalities through this court process, I thought I would say that the attorneys that represent towns through this court process, it varies. Some municipalities use their planning board attorney, like we did here. Some municipalities use their township attorney, and some municipalities have a special affordable housing attorney that handles it. So it really depends on who the municipality is most comfortable with and who might already be engaged in the town.
Hi, Kerry Heller, 56 Byron Road. Question for each of you. Joe, if I could start and just ask you one question. The developers agreements. Typically, the developer's agreement is signed and done after a planning board process. How are we, the community, going to know the true costs in advance if it's done at the township committee level for brick, mature trees, setback, other amenities, cleanup costs? I'm not sure how we really do a developer's agreement now, and then again after the planning board process.
This is a different process than the one you're referring to, which would be, you're referring to the typical process?
Yes.
That would occur when someone's going before the planning board with a project as of right under the zoning ordinance. We're dealing with a different animal, different creature here, so we're going to be negotiating a developer's agreement here. That will cover all the topics that I described in my earlier presentation.
Who will be part of that process to know that?
Well, I will be doing the legal negotiation. There'll be others on the team. This is a team effort here in the township, so there'll be many of us involved from time to time. There'll be a financial advisor that has been referred to earlier this evening. So there'll be a talented pool of people to provide input on that. And of course, we'll be negotiating with RPM.
But could you explain to the community, again, a lot of people are upset that they've heard about $1 for a sale price, or $1 million, or $10 million, or a land lease, subdivision, cleanup costs, insulated windows, mature trees. I want to ask a question.
Go ahead.
Explain to the community that we can get laundry in each unit, which I think there should be among other things, but this would be a second question maybe for the developer. Does not the subsidy from the town, the rents are fixed, does not the subsidy go up? If there's real estate taxes, not real estate taxes, does not the subsidy by us, whether it's $1 or $10 million, go up by the amenities?
There's going to be a very complex financial arrangement here. There's going to be a financial advisor to advise the township on all of those elements. Remember, this is a different kind of a project. This is an affordable housing project. It is not the type of a development project that you're used to hearing about. It's not a redevelopment project either. It's not a project where a redeveloper comes in, gets designated, and builds a redevelopment project where there is a significant revenue stream that, because it's a market-driven process. This is a controlled income process. So there will be a limit on the stream of funds into the developer to pay for this project. It's going to be a very complex balancing act between the purchase price for the property, all the other elements that go into making it financially work. Questions about obtaining funding from tax credit programs, Aspire programs.
9%.
There's a whole list of issues that we have to yet work out.
But the question, Alex, is about let me just finish. I think what you've heard all throughout from people asking is we want more inclusion. I support affordable housing. 1985 in Mount Laurel was to break up 5-acre zoning. I think most people in this room believe we should have an affordable component, but don't necessarily believe it should be in one site. That's for a different discussion. I'm not here to make comments tonight. But we would like to have involvement in the process to know whether these windows, again, you got a JCP&L substation, you got a train, you got the DPW, again, whether these people should live among all of us, we should live among them, but the costs and green space and green roof and solar and all the things that are going to come up at the planning board. Joe, whatever we negotiate here, whether I or someone else or others appeal this at the planning board process, the goal is not to stop this. The goal is to make sure that this gets accepted by the community, and the only way to do that is to involve the community in this part of the process.
Well, and just to comment on that, I think in terms of the next steps and what we talked about is having additional meetings with regarding the design, regarding what the community may feel in terms of green infrastructure or how green the building might be, because to your point, Carrie, additional wants will certainly have some impact on additional subsidy from the municipality. So, and that's all sort of in the process right now. But you're right, the township still has to decide whether it's going to be a 4% with Aspire. You had an article come out yesterday regarding an infusion from the state for $300 million. So there's a lot still that's involved in this, but, and certainly the next step is to get RPM out in front of the community so that we can dive into more of the design elements and design.
RPM will do whatever we want as long as we pay for it.
I understand that. I understand that. However, I think there's a balancing act there.
If I may, I'll go on. Ms. McManus, if I may, 2018, we submitted a plan to the state of New Jersey, or to Fair Share Housing, saying that we owe no units. If I'm maybe correct, I think there was a credit of either 13 or 17 units that we thought we were over as a result of the upland. The state responded to that. How many units did the state, Fair Share Housing, respond and say that we owed after our 2018 submittal?
Just to reiterate, our BLA was 17 units. Our RDP ended up with 17 units. Not
meaning our overage. Meaning we didn't have to build anything.
No, I think it was that we owed 17.
It's small.
It was small.
Amount.
So I don't know if I can directly answer your question because I wasn't involved until recently. So if there was communication in 2018, say, or 2019, or 2020 even with Fair Share Housing Center, I don't think I have that information. So I'm not sure I can answer your question.
Let me ask the second part.
Okay.
As part of the negotiations and advising the township committee, the two-member subcommittee, how many units, as a result of lowering our requirements, unmet need, and the density, how many units from what the state told us that we needed to build, and Joe, maybe this is to you, Graham, we haven't met, but maybe you know the answer. How many units as part of this process were you able to, as our representative, not as a special master, how many units were you able to negotiate our requirement down from?
Are you asking me where the number started when I got involved and where it ended?
Yes.
So by the time I stepped into Millburn, the obligation had been determined, and my role was to help them figure out how to meet that obligation.
Who determined that number?
It's subject to the negotiations with Fair Share Housing.
I'm saying prior to you, there were no negotiations.
No, I said prior to me, I wasn't involved in negotiations, so I don't know what may have occurred.
Second question, if I may. You've represented, again, you're esteemed in your profession and what you do. You, in this case, were representing Millburn.
Yes.
In many other places, I think the numbers come out as 40, that you've represented other towns as special master on behalf of Fair Share Housing.
Well, no, I represent the courts when I serve as special master. I do not represent Fair Share Housing Center.
But you do wear different hats in different communities, and you're representing, theoretically, maybe in practice, Millburn's best interest in stepping in spontaneously. For the gentleman who asked the question, we lost our longtime planner, which leads me to, and I'll let you off the hot seat. Graham, what date did your firm come into this process, more or less? But you weren't involved in this process. You weren't involved in this process. You've come in after the fact. So anything that you're doing right now is to, again, is engaged by the township. You're engaged by the township, not by Fair Share Housing, not by, you're helping the town at this point without having any standing in the process. So there was a very short period of time. In fact, you had a very short period of time, if I may bet.
Yeah.
A very short period of time, as per Mr. Buzak's description of responding very, very quickly.
Yes.
To Fair Share Housing.
Yes.
And negotiating and representing the two members of the Township Committee who were appointed by the Township Committee to represent the Township Committee, representing we, the community. You're representing.
I'm sorry, I'm having trouble following the question.
Representing.
I began working in Millburn in about mid-July 2021. The township settled just a handful of weeks later.
Right. If I may just, one last bit to the developer. To what I made mention earlier, and you said you don't know, there are models, but there's also anecdotal evidence of how many units or how many children per unit. By example, a community similar to Millburn, near North Caldwell project, Alex can call up tomorrow and find out how many kids are in that project in the school system. How many children in the North Caldwell project in the school system? 50 units are...
I don't know.
I find that irresponsible. You said that there was no way of knowing. You went over and over and said, anecdotal. You spent 5 minutes talking about this. And let me finish. participate in a lot of towns. I'm for the concept. But for you to stand here in front of the community and say that there's no way of really knowing that there's models from several years ago at the Hughes Center in Rutgers, he could know, you need to know, because we need to know for the questions that have been asked in terms of infrastructure, in terms of planning, in terms of getting children out of trailers. You need to stand here in front of the community and know that number. Because North Caldwell is not East Orange, it's not Orange, it's not Newark, it's not Pleasantville, it's not Westville, it's not Somerset. North Caldwell is probably more similar for height, density, zoning, Madison, similar. What's being proposed here is more or less a one-of-a-kind in the state of New Jersey in terms of the demographics. And again, I support the concept, I support inclusionary, but you need to know that number. Alex, do we know the number?
No, I don't.
Does the Township Committee know the number?
Do you want to answer the question?
No, nobody, do you, Mr. Cohn, do you know the number?
Can you let him answer?
So I did not come prepared with that comp this evening. And you're right, North Caldwell is a good example.
Okay, before we move on here, actually I'm going to give this back to you. All right, I don't need too much. So we are currently at 9:15. I think we can take another 20 minutes. If everybody could just please keep to 3 minutes, concise questions so that we can answer them. And certainly again, we will take the video here that we're shooting and be able to get back some of these inputs and some of these questions. Mr. Feld?
My name is Jeffrey Feld. First of all, I thank everyone that came here, especially citizens and the answers. I think we have to restore trust and confidence, and a lot of it is making sure we're all starting off on the same book and page. I think the next time you have a presentation, I think we should start from April 2018, when we did file a fair share plan as part of declaratory judgment, and that we understand how we got from an RDP of 17 to 114. And we should understand how we started with some certain overlay densities in April 2018 to the number that was given in July 2021. I think we should know tonight or in the next few days, when did the 120-day clock begin? So everyone knows when is the next deadline. We should know when the clock began. We heard about negotiating a redeveloper agreement. That's like an option. And when we were in front of the Township Committee, we asked, when does this option expire? That's a contractual term. I've heard no one's given us an answer. How long this process can go on? Or if a certain date comes on, if they don't come to agreement, you go to the next party. I think the community is entitled to know when the drop dead date is for RPM. As to the Upton project, there was supposed to be a hotel function or segment of that. That has not occurred. What's the status? Are we going back to them saying, are you going to build a hotel? Or can we use that space that was going to be a hotel, maybe for some mixed income projects? I don't know the answer. I don't know what's happening there. We keep on talking about the projects focusing on the DPW site. We're losing sight of Annie Says. I don't want to go through what we went through with Woodlands. We're going to have 9 months of negotiations and yelling and screaming at a planning board. I think it's very important that we know what are the conditions. I attended about 3 weeks ago, New Jersey Institute of Continuing Legal Education seminar on redevelopment. Ms. McManus, you were like in the last group. And one of the concepts that they had throughout the evening is how do we deal with redevelopment? Do we deal with it through ordinances or redevelopment plans where you set forth? And I think the consensus from the 7 hours is that you want to get the agreements up front. You don't want to have wars and shifting everything to the planning board and having battles whether there's going to be a variance for something. And that goes back to what Jay said before. It's very important for these overlay districts that we know what the rules of the game are. Again, I thank you for your time. But a lot of the questions I'm asking for, I'm still looking for answers from the first meeting in January 10th. I submitted written questions. I'm still looking for answers. This is all going back to due diligence and building trust and confidence within our community.
Mr. Phil, in regard to the questions that you had submitted previously, I would just ask that, if possible, that you pare them down. You submitted, yeah, it was actually 81. Yeah. So, I asked Mr. Phil if he could pare them down and make them relevant to the conversation. We'll be happy to answer what we can.
I could just answer two of the questions that were asked with respect to the drop dead date with the development. There isn't any fixed date. It's a judgment call that we'll make, and as we see how we're doing, if we get to a point where we're not making progress, we'll stop and go on to the next. We're not putting ourselves in a straitjacket with respect to that. With respect to the ICL course you referred to, that sounds like that was about redevelopment process. This is not the redevelopment. This is not a redevelopment process. This is a different process here.
There's sections on affordable housing and how you dealt with it.
Yes.
It's an issue that we talked about consistently.
In every redevelopment project, there's always a component of affordable housing. This is different. This is 100% affordable housing. It's not a mixed development. It's not a typical redevelopment project.
Good evening. A gentleman sitting next to me used the term consequences. I've been in this town over 40 years. I don't know how many people here have been this long. And I remember when I came to this town, there was a school called Short Hill School, elementary school. A year later, it was taken down, and the property was sold for developers to build housing. My kids went through the entire 12, 13 years of schooling. And in the mid-90s, when my kids graduated, there were 150 graduates that particular year. Do you know how many graduates graduating this year? Anybody? 400 some. Okay. At the same time, there was a Washington school. They closed it. It was leased. South Mountain School was closed, was leased. Question is, why? And the answer is simple. People did not, whoever was in charge, did not use the demographic studies. There was a reduction in, not in population of the town, but in children. You know how often an average family changes housing these days? 7 to 10 years. In the 50s and 60s and 70s, how often did people change houses? Maybe 40 years. So the bottom line is, at that time, the people settled in most of Short Hills area were people that worked in Manhattan and had this as a house, you know, for vacation, weekends. But then they stayed and became residents, permanent residents of Millburn Township, and their kids grew and left. But they stayed for 20 and 30 years, childless. Now, in the last 20 years, the demographics have changed because the houses change hands every 7 to 10 years. And who comes to town? People that have young kids because they want good school system. So I wonder, what's the study of demographics been done lately to see what's going to happen in 5 or 10 years from now, especially when we add another 300 units, 400 units? Let me just give you a couple other numbers. Last year, middle school added 60 students to their roster. This year, estimate 100. schools, class sizes used to be 20, 25 kids. What is it now? 35 kids. How many trailers do we have in middle school? We have several. They don't have classrooms. So now we're going to put 75 units within a year or two. Where are we going to put those kids? I would like to suggest something. Let's start slowly. Let's start with a small project. Let's start with maybe limiting some of the apartments just for senior citizens, that they might not have children anymore. Right? Small apartments that will limit the number of people that will live in the apartment, and see how that works. What's the growth in population? And have some understanding what's going to happen, the consequences. So as you can see, the consequences, we already know the consequences from history of this town. And we don't want to repeat it again. Thank you.
There's people having.
Okay, so I think this gentleman told you the history about how 3 schools were closed in this town in the late 70s and early 80s because there was a real dip in the population. But then when people like me moved in the early 80s, the young baby boomers, so many people came in, all of a sudden, one school had been raised and they couldn't get it back. The reason, you said that the South Mountain School was leased and the other one, the Washington. What happened with the South Mountain School was they wanted to knock that down too and build a couple of houses. And then be like, oh, we'll make some money, we're going to sell the property. The mothers and parents in my neighborhood, which is South Mountain, worked and worked and worked. I don't know if anybody was here at that time. They worked very hard to keep that school not being knocked down and to lease it. And it was leased to a daycare center. And when we had a population explosion due to people like me and all my new neighbors that were coming in with me, that school was able to get rid of that lease and open up to the town. Now, this has nothing to do with these developers. I'm just saying this to everybody who's stayed this long, that if people try to get something done here because it's the right thing to do, like save a school, or figure out population densities and children in the schools and traffic on the street, it's been done before, and we can do it again.
Thank you. My name is Tom Chase of 6 Clinton Place in Millburn. This process is, I guess I'll push back a little bit of what I've heard tonight. I mean, this process has been coming at us for about 50 years now. The Supreme Court decided this in 1974, 75. So the idea of like, oh my God, slow down, don't move so fast, what are you doing, it's crazy. I mean, this has been coming at us for a long time. And there have been many Supreme Court cases reaffirming municipalities' obligations to act. And finally, we had a lot of pressure to act, and we did. But the idea that it's just like, haphazardly sprung up and now we're acting is incorrect in my view. Just so one specific question. So by my understanding, in July 2025, the immunity that we now have gotten from the settlement agreement is lifted, as it is throughout the state. Every municipality is then subject, again, to builders' remedy lawsuits. So our goal, looking forward, has to be to make enough progress so that we are not attractive litigation targets for developers who might file that kind of lawsuit. That's my understanding. What does the panel think we have to do to get to that point where things stand now, legally and legislatively, to sort of not be an attractive target? Got to do something. What's enough to do, but maybe not too much?
So in terms of Millburn being an attractive target for builder's remedy, So there's two components of that. One is protecting ourselves against builder's remedy, and I think that's really on point to your question, and I'll answer that. But in terms of making us attractive, Millburn is attractive today. Well, we were attractive yesterday, and we'll be attractive tomorrow because we're a fantastic community, and people want to build here because they see opportunities. So what we need to do to counter that is to make sure that we maintain our immunity, and that is really the crux of your question. So one of the things I said earlier was, it's okay if our overlay zones don't develop, and that is okay, because there are, with each of these mechanisms, it comes with each of the different types of mechanisms, it comes with differing obligations. So for our overlay zones that I went through, we are obligated to adopt those ordinances and work with any developer that makes a site plan approval. For our RDP sites, Canoe Brook property, Upton, that's constructed, so we're done. We can sort of check that off our list. For, say, the Annie Says property and the Wells Fargo property that's already been approved. So for the Annie Says property, we're obligated to adopt an ordinance, which we've done, and then presumably that developer is going to come before the planning board for site plan approval. The planning board is obligated to issue an approval to that application, provided the developer justifies the approval. They meet the ordinance standards, they meet the purposes of the municipal land use law, etc. So for those types of mechanisms where we have inclusionary zoning in place, we are obligated to adopt the ordinance and to work with the developer when they make a site plan application. For the DPW property, that is in an entirely different category as a 100% municipally sponsored, 100% approval, 100% affordable municipally sponsored construction project. Those types of projects are actually required to be directly facilitated and facilitated by the municipality, and they are actually required to be constructed. So unlike the other mechanisms, like those overlay zones, the Annie Says properties that I discussed, those are driven by the developers. The municipality has to put the zoning in place for the developer to later take advantage of through the site plan approval. For the 100% affordable housing, we are obligated to do more than that. We have to actually push that project through and directly help the developer get that project done. So that means, for example, we had to go through the developer selection process. That's clearly underway now, with RPM being the conditionally designated developer. The next step is to put the standards in place. The next step after that will be to support the developer's application for outside funding sources. They'll then make site plan application. We're obligated to support that. Essentially, the municipality is obligated for this 100% project to do more than simply put the zoning in place. We have to work hand in hand in partnership with the developer to make sure that project gets built, and it's required to be under construction within 2 years of execution of this settlement agreement, although there's a little bit of wiggle room depending on on the timing of the funding. That's outside the control of Millburn and outside the control of the developer, but it's, in broad speaking terms, it's about a 2-year window for us to get a shovel in the ground for that project. So that carries a different obligation with it. And so at the end of the day, by 2025, by July of 2025, we will have all of our zoning in place. We should have shovels in the ground for this project. And at that point, Millburn will have done everything. There's a lot more detail to that, but generally, Millburn will have done everything necessary to maintain its immunity. Now, when July 2025 comes, as you said, you are correct, immunity will be potentially lifted for every municipality in the state. I would like to think that there's going to be some action before then that will give guidance to towns, but if nothing happens, I think what's likely is municipalities will be obligated to file another action in court by that July 2025 date in order to restart immunity for what will be the 4th round at that point. Once we make that filing, the courts will determine, they will evaluate the request based on a number of factors. One of those will be, did Millburn and other communities, did they do everything that was necessary in order to generate a renewal of that immunity?
Presumably, if Millburn does everything I've just outlined, the answer will easily be yes.
Is that sort of a consensus that's building that municipalities will need to file another declaratory action prior to July 2025?
God, I hope not, but...
Or where are you getting that from?
Well,
or do we wait until we're sued and we defend these actions by saying, look,
no. I don't think anybody here is going to suggest we should wait to be sued. If nothing else happens, in the sense that COA doesn't come back in action to issue new rules, and we don't have an amended Fair Housing Act, essentially all municipalities' orders of compliance read roughly the same way, which is your immunity lasts to the end of the third round. And so by that very nature, unless we have an interjection from the state, we'll have the same scenario as we did in 2015, which is municipalities, you have to go through the court process for your fourth round review and approval. And so that will dictate a similar process to what we saw in 2015, which is that filing.
I mean, is there authority that indicates that filing another declaratory action will just by dint of filing get us immunity?
Yeah, I believe that is the case. Yes.
Lawyers? That's the Supreme Court?
The Fair Housing Act provides either filing before COA for substantive certification or filing a declaratory judgment to obtain a judgment of compliance and repose. That has been the law since 1985. Municipalities had an option to do either of those things. The majority, more than the majority of them, went through the COA administrative process to get substantive certification. But any of those municipalities could have filed a declaratory judgment action.
That declaratory judgment action option still exists.
That's
correct. As strong as it existed.
That's
I thought there was a deadline by 2018 that we had to meet. Just barely that, but we didn't.
No. And I think as Ms. McManus said, the municipalities will likely, if nothing else happens, if there's no changes in the Fair Housing Act, if there's no legislative act, if there's no COA resurrection through the appointment of members and adoption of regulations, municipalities, their only option will be to file a declaratory judgment action and a simultaneous request for immunity. Now, in order to do that, you have to recognize that there's prerequisites. So you can't start on July 1 and just file a declaratory judgment action. What will have to happen in probably 2024 or maybe late next year, you're going to have to be thinking about, well, what's your obligation for the fourth round? How are you going to comply and put together a proposed housing element and fair share plan for the fourth round?
So that's what we got.
So those are the kinds of, at the end, that's correct.
In anticipation of the next round of litigation.
That's what all municipalities will have to do if they want to be able to file a declaratory judgment action and try to obtain immunity. Others can do nothing and wait and hope that they don't get sued in a builder's remedy, because as of July 1, as Mr. McManus said, virtually all of the immunities will be lifted for all of the municipalities. I want to clarify one thing. We've talked about this 120-day period, and when does it start? I think Mr. Feld wanted to know exactly when it starts. It's not a 120-day period. If you look at the court order that was entered, we had sought a 120-day period because that's the typical period you have within which to comply with the preliminary judgment of compliance and repose. In our case, if any of you were at the hearing, the judge set the final hearing for June 10th, and the court order provides that by June 10th of 2022, we need to have complied or implemented the settlement agreement. So we actually had a little bit more than 120 days, if you count those days out. June 10th is just beyond that 120 days. But that's the date by which we have to comply.
Thanks, sir.
I have a question about the terms of the contract for the land that the developer is going to be buying. In New York, there was Mitchell-Lama, which expired. They had contracts that went anywhere from 20 to 35 years for middle-income housing. And then once those contracts expired, my understanding is that the housing that was offered was then allowed to go to market rate. So my question is whether that's applicable to this project, whether there will be a term set in the contract that allows, that once it expires, that the developer will then be allowed to let these apartments go to market rate, and if that is the case, whether that or not that will be taken into consideration in negotiating how much the town sells the land for.
In the applicable affordable housing rules is 30 years, but in this situation, for our settlement negotiations with Fair Share Housing Center, Millburn has agreed to require 45 years, so controls of not less than 45 years. The units will be affordable for. And so I'm going to defer to any other.
We're going to be negotiating what happens to this property. We're going to be negotiating the possibility of an option to purchase the property at a certain point in time when the financing has matured to a certain level. This is all premature, but these are all good questions, and they'll be part of the mixture of what comes through the process of the final outcome.